I had been staring at my phone for 3 hours before I finally gathered the courage to tap his name on the screen. My son S.F. name. The same name I had whispered with love for 35 years. The same name I had written on school lunch bags, birthday cakes, and savings envelopes. And when he answered with a distracted hello, as if I were some stranger interrupting his day, I felt a strange coldness crawl up my spine. Yet I forced cheer into my voice and asked, trying to sound light and unbothered, Max, sweetheart, I heard there was a party last night. Did something special happen, and I just misunderstood? There was a pause on the other end that stretched far too long for comfort, a silence filled with muffled sounds, laughter, and clinking glasses, as if he had walked away from the noise to speak to me, and then he finally said, not unkindly but without warmth either, Mom, it was better this way, and those 5 words seemed to fall into the pit of my stomach like stones, each one heavier than the last, better without me, better without my presence, better without the woman who raised him alone after his father died, better without the same woman who had sold her wedding ring to pay his college application fee, better without the mother who had once slept hungry so he could eat first. And I was standing in my small kitchen, holding the phone as if it had suddenly become something foreign in my hand, while outside my neighbor's dog barked and the world went on as if it had not just shattered inside me. And slowly I asked, barely hearing my own voice, better for who, Max? And he sighed as though my question was inconvenient. It was just a friend thing, Mom. You would be felt out of place, and out of place. Those words burned more deeply than an insult because this was my child, my only child, the boy who had once cried if I left him at school for too long, the little hands that once held my fingers as if I were his entire universe, and now I was supposedly the one out of place in his life, in his world, at a celebration that everyone else had been welcome to attend except me, and something broke inside me then, something that had been stretched far too thin for far too long. But I did not cry, not yet. I simply ended the call quietly and placed the phone on the table as if it had betrayed me, as if it were an accomplice to the cruelty that had just brushed against my heart. And I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, looking at the chair at the table that had always belonged to Max whenever he visited, which in truth he never did anymore, and memories flooded me against my will, flashes of birthday parties I had organized for him when he was little, scraping every penny together to make sure he had balloons, cake, gifts, children laughing around him, because I had always wanted him to feel special, to feel like the world celebrated his existence, and now he had taken that same feeling and locked it behind a door I was no longer allowed to open, and foolishly, almost desperately, I opened social media, my hands trembling like old leaves in the wind, and there it was, the evidence of my exclusion glowing brightly on the screen, photos of him standing with people I didn't recognize, his arm around a woman I had only met once briefly, his smile wide and unrestrained in a way I hadn't seen in years, long tables covered in expensive food, balloons spelling out something that I couldn't fully read but clearly meant celebration. And in the corner of one photo, I saw a banner with my son's name on it, a banner I had not paid for, had not designed, had not been asked to see, and the comments beneath the photos were filled with congratulations and love and laughter, people praising the event, praising the hosts, praising my son as if he had been born to them and not to me. And the realization hit me with unbearable clarity that this was no accident. This was no misunderstanding. This was a deliberate erasure, as if a part of his life had been surgically removed, and I was that part, disposable, inconvenient, no longer useful now that he had another world, another circle, another family that did not include the woman who had sacrificed everything to get him there. And slowly, I sank into the chair beside the table, the same chair where I had once helped him with homework, where I had once kissed his forehead when he fell asleep face down on his books, promising me that one day he would take care of me just as I had taken care of him. Promises that now haunted me like ghosts that had no bodies. And I started counting in my mind as though numbers could somehow explain betrayal. The money I had given him over the years, for emergencies, for rent, for his car, for his ambitions, for his girlfriend, for temporary situations that somehow lasted years, the thousands I had spent sharpening his future while my own life grew dull and neglected, because every time I thought of fixing my roof, repairing my car, buying myself a new coat, I remembered that Max might need something more important, and so I saved for him again and again, thinking that love worked like a bank account, that the more I gave, the more it would grow, until I was left empty, but still convincing myself that one day he would recognize my devotion and come back to me with gratitude in his eyes. But yesterday, photos were proof that my devotion had been erased like chalk on a blackboard washed clean for a new lesson. And I wondered what else I had missed before this. How many gatherings had taken place without my knowledge? How many jokes had been told about me once my back was turned? How many people had sat at my son's table and never even known my name? And perhaps I was partly to blame for allowing myself to become invisible, for shrinking quietly into the background while making his life the front and center of my world. But knowing this did not ease the ache in my chest, the hollow echo I felt in my ribcage, where a heart should have been beating proudly instead of breaking silently. And sometime later, when the sun had already begun falling and painting the walls orange, his name flashed on my screen again, and part of me feared answering, feared hearing more words that would carve deeper wounds. But another part needed clarity the way lungs need air. And so I answered calmly and said, "Max, you said it was better this way. Can you explain to me what that means?" And he exhaled loudly like a tired man burdened by questions he felt he shouldn't have to answer. "Mom, these are people from my life now, from my work, my future. It is complicated, and you wouldn't really fit in with them. I was just trying to spare you the awkwardness, and awkwardness, the word twisted in my mind, because he had never been spared awkwardness before. He had tripped on stages, failed classes, brought home the wrong girl, made terrible decisions, and yet I had stood beside him through it all, defending him, supporting him, loving him, never once apologizing for his existence, and now he was apologizing for mine, as if I were an embarrassment wrapped in old skin and tired eyes, and I asked him quietly, "Am I such a burden to you now?" And he paused for a moment too long again before saying something that will echo inside me for the rest of my life. "Mom, you just live in the past too much." And that was when I realized the most painful truth of all, that to him, I was part of a past he wanted to forget, a chapter he had closed when he stepped into his new future, a mother-shaped shadow he wished would fade quietly into the background, without making noise, without asking questions, without reminding him of the road that had carried him here. And it was in that moment, with the phone pressed to my ear and my long, tired reflection staring back at me from the darkened window, that something old inside me finally went still, something that had spent years begging for scraps of love, and something new rose in its place, cold, observant, alert, and dangerous in its clarity, because I suddenly understood that this was not just about a party, it was about a lifetime of being slowly erased. And if I did not take control of what remained of my story, then I too would disappear as if I had never mattered at all. And it was with that realization, as I gently placed the phone down and stared at my own hands, the same hands that had fed him, protected him, worked for him, that I began to realize this was not the end of my story at all. It was the beginning of the moment where I would finally decide who I was, without his approval, without his inclusion, and without his permission. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I felt was not the usual rush of anxiety that had become my silent alarm clock, wondering if Max needed something, if I had missed a bill for him, if I should call to check on him, but a strange, unfamiliar stillness, like the air after a storm when everything is damp and raw but oddly clear. And for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet of my small apartment, realizing that for the first time in years, my first thought wasn't about my son. It was about myself, about the way his words "it was better this way" had sliced through me, and how that sentence had not been born the night before, but had probably been forming for a long time in the shadows of conversations I didn't hear and plans I wasn't included in. I shuffled into the kitchen and made coffee on autopilot, the way I had done almost every day since he moved out years ago, back when I still believed that motherhood was a lifelong job description and not a temporary contract that expired as soon as the child no longer found it convenient. And as I poured the coffee into my chipped white mug, I glanced at the small corkboard on the wall where I had pinned faded receipts, notes, little scribbles with amounts and dates, all of them related to Max somehow: rent support March, car insurance, loan payment, emergency dentist, each piece of paper a quiet witness to my unconditional giving. And for the first time, I felt an urge not to add another note, but to remove them, to clear that board as if I were erasing the proof of my own self-neglect. Instead of ripping them down blindly, I sat at the table, took a deep breath, and brought a notebook and pen from the drawer, the same notebook where I wrote shopping lists and recipes, and with a trembling hand, I wrote at the top of a fresh page, "How much have I given Max?" And underneath it, not just money, time, health, dreams, and suddenly my eyes filled with tears, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming realization that I had never dared to ask myself this question honestly, because I had always been afraid of the answer, afraid that if I put numbers to my sacrifices, I would finally be forced to admit that something was terribly wrong. I started with the obvious things, the fixed amounts I remembered clearly, the months I helped him with rent when he first moved in with his then-girlfriend, now fiancé, now apparently the center of his universe, and I wrote, rent, 18 months x 400, then beneath that, car, 2,000 down payment, credit card debt, 3,500, laptop for work, 900, weekend trip to relax after stressful project, 600. And as the list grew, the numbers began to look like they belonged to some stranger with money to burn, not to a woman who rationed her heating in winter so the gas bill wouldn't be too high, who watered down soap to make it last longer, who turned off lights obsessively, not out of environmental awareness, but out of pure financial fear. And yet, I had always found a way to say yes to him, yes to one more temporary help, one more just this once, one more I'll pay you back when I can, words that had never materialized into action. As I wrote, memories tagged themselves to each line, like emotional price tags glued to every euro. The rent support reminded me of the first time he had called, voice low and anxious, "Mom, they were going to kick us out if I don't pay this week," and the panic that had rushed through me like electricity, because the idea of my son without a roof was more unbearable than the thought of my own empty pantry. And so I'd gone to the bank, withdrawn from the small savings account I had built over years, and told myself that this was what mothers were supposed to do, that this was love. The car down payment pulled up the memory of him standing in the dealership parking lot, eyes shining like a child, saying, "With a car, I can get better jobs, Mom. It's an investment," and how I had nodded, ignoring the pinch in my chest when I signed the paperwork as co-signer, promising to myself that he would be careful, responsible, grateful. The credit card debt reminded me of nights when he had come to me, clenched jaw and tired eyes, talking about interest rates and bad decisions, and how I had told him, "Everyone makes mistakes, darling," as I wrote a check to clean up messes that were never really mine. All of those memories had been wrapped in the pretty bow of love in my mind, but now, laid bare in black ink on white paper, they began to look different, like pieces of a puzzle I had never stepped back far enough to see. And the picture they formed did not look like love. It looked like dependence, like entitlement, like a one-way street where I walked toward him while he rarely took a step toward me unless there was something in my hands. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at it, half expecting another casual, careless message, but instead I saw a simple line. "Hey, Mom, are you mad about the party?" And for a moment I wanted to laugh, a short, harsh laugh, because mad was such a small word for what I felt. Mad was what you felt when your coffee spilled, or someone cut you off in traffic, not when you had been neatly edited out of your own child's life like an unwanted scene in a movie. My fingertips hovered over the keyboard as dozens of possible answers rushed through my mind, from long emotional monologues to icy silence, before I finally wrote, "No, I am not mad. I am thinking," and then I put the phone face down because I knew what would come next. The explanations, the excuses, the carefully worded phrases that tried to paint cruelty as kindness and exclusion as consideration, and I didn't want to read them just yet. I finished adding amounts to my list, my handwriting growing shakier as the total climbed higher and higher, and when I finally did the math with my old pocket calculator, the numbers on the screen made my breath catch. Nearly 24,000 in just the last few years, not counting what I had invested in his upbringing, his education, his childhood dreams, which had no price tag but had cost me everything. 24,000. More than some people saved over a decade. More than enough for me to renovate my small apartment, take a long holiday by the sea, or simply breathe easier for the rest of my days without worrying about unexpected expenses. But instead, it had vanished into someone else's life, into rent and gadgets and dinners out, and parties where I never sat at the table. As I sat there staring at that number, my phone rang again, this time with his name, flashing insistently, and I knew that avoiding him forever was not an option, not yet, because there was one thing I needed more than closure: truth. I answered, and before I could say anything, his voice came rushing through, a little too upbeat, a little too rehearsed. "Mom, listen, about last night. Don't take it personally, okay? It was just one of those things." I took a deep breath, feeling a calm that did not match the turmoil inside me, and said, "Then explain it to me so I can make sure I'm not misunderstanding, Max. You had a party, you invited your friends, your colleagues, your fiancé's family, and you chose not to invite your own mother. Why?" He sighed, irritated now, and I could almost picture him running a hand through his hair the way he had as a teenager when caught in a lie. "Mom, you know how you are. You ask questions. You get emotional. You talk about the past, and I didn't want any drama. It was supposed to be a fun night. No guilt, no childhood stories, just us. Us." The word stung because in that us, I was clearly not included, and suddenly I heard myself ask a question even I hadn't anticipated. "Do you feel ashamed of me, Max?" And there was another one of those long silences before he said softly, "It's not that I'm ashamed, it's just you don't really get my life now, Mom." It was astonishing how someone could stab you with words without ever raising their voice. "I see," I said, "but I get your bills, Dante. The silence this time was sharp, almost metallic, and I imagined his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. What's that supposed to mean? I looked at my notebook, at the frightening total circled on the page, and I realized that this might be the first time I had ever forced him to confront the reality of what I had given, because I had always made my sacrifices invisible, quietly paying from the shadows so he could stand confidently in the spotlight. "It means," I replied, "that while you think I don't understand your life enough to stand in a room with your friends, I have somehow understood it well enough to keep it financially afloat for years. That's an interesting difference in value." He exhaled loudly again. "Mom, please don't make this about money. You always do this when you're upset." I almost choked at the unfairness of it. I had spent years avoiding talking about money, saying yes before he even finished asking, hiding my bank statements from myself, dulling my own fear so he wouldn't feel any. And now he was accusing me of being the one who made it about money simply because I dared to mention it. "I didn't make it about money, Max," I said quietly. "You did. Every time you came to me only when you needed it." There it was. The truth laid bare between us, and I could feel him bristle on the other end of the line. "That's not fair. I call you for other things too." "Do you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When was the last time you called, just to ask how I was, without a problem attached?" Again, the silence that answered me was more honest than any of his words. "This isn't productive," he muttered. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't sulking about the party." "I'm not sulking," I replied. "I'm observing, and I'm thinking about making some changes." The moment I said it, the air between us shifted, and I could almost feel his attention sharpen, like a predator smelling something it didn't like. "What kind of changes?" he asked slowly. I glanced at the notebook again and felt that new, cold clarity grow roots inside me. "Don't worry," I said. "You'll notice them soon enough." I hung up before he could argue, and my heart pounded in my chest, loud and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone braver than I'd ever been. My hands trembled, but not with fear, at least not only with fear, but with the shock of having set a boundary, however vague, and I wasn't used to that. All morning, I paced the apartment, replaying the conversation in my head, half proud and half terrified of my own words, and eventually the walls began to feel too close, the air too heavy, and I grabbed my coat and went outside, into the crisp daylight. The small park a few blocks away was nearly empty, just a couple of children on swings and an old man reading a newspaper on a bench, and as I walked along the path scattered with dry leaves, my memories followed me like shadows, reminding me of the days I had pushed Max on similar swings, how he used to scream with laughter, calling out, "Higher, Mom, higher!" and how I had always obliged even when my arms ached, because it made him happy, because that's what mothers did. They pushed their children higher, beyond their own limits if necessary. Somewhere along the way, though, he had learned to kick off himself, and I had never stopped pushing. And now here we were. He was soaring in his own sky, and I was still standing there with my hands outstretched, waiting to feel needed again. I sat on a bench and watched a little boy run to his mother with a scraped knee, watched her kneel, fuss, kiss it better, and I felt a pang of envy so sharp it embarrassed me, a ridiculous jealousy over someone else present when mine was long gone. But I couldn't help imagining the future version of that same child telling her one day it was better this way, as he shut her out of his life, and I silently begged whatever force was listening that this woman on the bench might be spared that particular heartbreak. As I sat there, lost in thought, a familiar voice startled me. "You're out early today?" I looked up to see my neighbor, Elena, standing beside the bench with a grocery bag in her hand, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun, kind eyes examining my face with more attention than I was used to. We had exchanged polite hellos in the hallway for years, but never much more. Because when your life revolves around someone who doesn't revolve around you, you forget how to be a person with friends. "I needed some fresh air," I replied, forcing a small smile. She sat down beside me uninvited, but not unwelcome, and we watched the children in silence for a moment before she said, almost casually, "I saw photos of a party yesterday. Your boy looked handsome." Her words stung and soothed at the same time. I was relieved to know I wasn't the only one who had seen the evidence of my absence, and yet that very fact made my humiliation feel public. "Yes," I said, my voice catching slightly. "He had a party." "You weren't there," she stated gently, not as a question, but as a simple observation. My cheeks burned, and in that moment I could have laughed or lied or brushed it away, but something inside me was tired of pretending, tired of making excuses for someone who didn't bother to hide their disrespect. "No," I answered quietly. "I wasn't invited." Elena let out a soft ah, filled with understanding rather than curiosity, and she nodded slowly as if she had just been handed the last piece of a puzzle she'd been studying from afar. "Children forget," she said after a moment. "They forget who stood behind them when no one else did. Mine did too for a while." I turned to look at her, surprised, because I'd always imagined her as a woman whose life was perfectly balanced, whose children visit often with flowers and grandchildren. But now I realized that we are all experts at hiding our wounds in public. "What happened?" I asked before I could stop myself. She smiled sadly. They remembered, but only after I stopped doing their remembering for them. I frowned, not understanding. She chuckled softly at my confusion. I stopped paying their bills, lending money, arranging their lives. They hated me for a while. Then, slowly, they started calling again, not for help, but for conversation. You'd be amazed how quickly respect returns when the money dries up. Her words hit me like a quiet explosion, rearranging my thoughts without raising their voice. It was such a simple idea, and yet revolutionary to someone like me who had always equated generosity with love. "Weren't you afraid they would leave you forever?" I whispered. "Of course," she replied, "but I was more afraid of dying, without ever having lived for myself." We sat in silence after that, and her words settled into my bones like seeds looking for a place to take root. On the way home, I felt heavier with reality, but lighter with possibility. By the time I unlocked my door, I had already decided what my first change would be, even if the thought made my stomach twist. I went straight to the small drawer where I kept my bank papers, the ones I usually avoided unless absolutely necessary, because they reminded me of a life I had never learned to prioritize, and I pulled out the document I knew too well, the automatic transfer order, set up months ago, sending a portion of my pension directly to Mac's account every month, so he wouldn't have to worry about basics, as he had put it. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and called the bank, but my voice was steady when I spoke to the clerk. "I'd like to cancel a standing transfer," I said. "Yes, immediately." The young woman on the other end was polite and efficient, and the whole process took less than 10 minutes. But to me, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and deciding, for the first time, not to jump just because my son said he needed wings. When she confirmed that the transfer was canceled, a strange sensation overcame me, part fear, part liberation, as if someone had just cut a rope that had been wrapped around my chest. "Is there anything else we can help you with, Mrs.?" she asked, but I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "No," I murmured. "You've done enough." After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, waiting, knowing that it wouldn't take long, and sure enough, less than an hour later, a message came in from Max. "Hey, did the rent transfer fail? The landlord just texted me." My heart sprinted, but my fingers felt oddly calm as I typed my reply. I canceled it. There was no need for explanations, no apologies, just those 3 words, and I pressed send before I could second-guess myself. A moment later, my phone rang, his name flashing insistently as if the screen itself were shouting, "Answer, answer, you owe him that much." But for the first time in a very long time, I let it ring without picking up. I watched the screen light up and go dark, light up and go dark, until it finally stayed dark, and the silence that followed was not comfortable, not yet, but it was mine, and for the first time I allowed myself to sit in it without rushing to fill it with excuses or apologies. I didn't know it then, but that small action, the canceling of a monthly transfer, would be the first tremor of an earthquake that would shake everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and what it really meant to be a mother, because my son did not take this quietly, and the party that had started with my exclusion was only the first chapter of a much bigger war he was about to wage to keep me in the role he had assigned me, not as his mother, but as his permanent safety net. The silence after I canceled the transfer did not last nearly as long as I had imagined, because by the next morning my phone was no longer ringing. It was under attack, vibrating on the table like a trapped insect, as messages poured in faster than I could even read them, some from Max, some from unknown numbers that I knew had to be his fiancé, his friends, maybe even people I had never met. All of them suddenly finding my existence essential now that the money had stopped flowing. And the first message from Max was almost polite in its uncertainty. "Mom, maybe there was a mistake at the bank. Can you check again for me?" Followed by a second 30 seconds later when I didn't respond, "This is not funny. Why would you cancel it without warning?" And then a third, sharper now, "We have obligations. You can just change things without talking to me," as if I were an employee who had disobeyed my employer rather than a grown woman with a lifetime behind her. And I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen, feeling an odd calm settle in my chest, a stillness that felt less like surrender and more like awakening. And instead of rushing to explain, instead of apologizing or justifying myself, I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway, and for the first time in a very long while, truly looked at the woman staring back at me, not as Max's mother, not as someone a safety net, but simply as me, noticing the lines that had formed from years of worry, the tiredness etched into my eyes, and the faint glimmer of something new there, something more solid than fear, something like self-respect slowly returning from a very long exile. When I finally sat back down, my phone rang again, this time not a message but a full call, and I knew by the way the name flashed that this would not be calm. So I answered, and his voice hit me immediately. No greeting, no warmth, only anger dressed as concern. "What the hell are you doing, Mom? The landlord is threatening us now. Do you realize what position you've put us in?" And I listened quietly as he spoke, the resentment pouring out of him as if I had suddenly committed a crime, as if the years of support had never existed, and the only thing that mattered was this one moment where I dared to say no. And without raising my voice, I replied, "I'm in the same position I've been in for years, Max. The only difference is that now you're feeling it instead of me, and that EOS S when he snapped because I had broken an unspoken rule. I had spoken a truth he did not want to hear, and suddenly he was no longer my boy on the phone. He was a stranger shouting at the woman who had given him life. You're being selfish? After everything I've been through, everything I need right now, you choose to cut me off? Do you even love me?" The question echoed in my head, like a cruel parody of all the sacrifices I had made in the name of love, and for a split second, the old familiar guilt tried to claw its way back into my chest. The instinct to fix, to soothe, to pay, but this time I grabbed that feeling before it could drown me and held it up to the light, examining it instead of obeying it, and I answered him clearly, if I didn't love you, I would not have spent the last years of my life financing yours. But love also means teaching you that you cannot build your comfort on someone else. Exhaustion. You're supposed to help family, he barked back. I have helped you, I replied quietly. Now, you need to help yourself. There was a sharp silence, and then I heard another voice on the line, a whisper that was supposed to be out of my hearing range, but which I recognized instantly. His fiancée S, saying something like, tell her she's doing this on purpose. She's always been manipulative. And that word, manipulative, nearly made me laugh out loud. The irony so deep it was almost poetic, because if manipulation had a face in that moment, it was not mine. And suddenly Max came back on the line with more venom than I had ever heard from him. You think you're some hero now? You think because of some stupid party I didn't even want, you're justified in ruining our lives? You're bitter and alone, Mom, and instead of fixing that, you're trying to drag us down with you. And his words hurt. Of course they did, because he knew exactly where to aim. He knew my fears. He knew my softest points. But strangely, beneath the pain, another realization began to form, quieter but stronger. He was not speaking as my son in that moment. He was speaking as someone who had just lost control over a resource he had taken for granted. And everything he said was not about love, not about connection, but about access, and that truth steadied me like a hand on my back. You will not drag me into an argument anymore, Max, I said, my voice suddenly as firm as stone. You are an adult. Solve your own problems. Then I ended the call, something I had never done in all his years, and I placed the phone back on the table as if closing a heavy door that had been open far too long. For a few seconds, or maybe minutes, I stood there frozen, hands still hovering in the air, and then I sat down and began to cry. Not the kind of desperate sobs that left me gasping, but a slow, quiet release, tears sliding down my face as if washing away layers of guilt, expectations, illusions that I had carried for decades, and when they finally stopped, there was nothing left behind them but an emptiness that felt strangely clean, like a room after all the clutter has been thrown out. I did not know what would happen next, only that something irreversible had just taken place, a line drawn not in ink or blood, but in the quiet decision of a tired heart that had finally decided to protect itself, and the next few days seemed to pass in a strange blur of tension and stillness, because on one hand, my phone was mercifully silent, no calls, no texts, no demands, and on the other, every little sound in the hallway outside my door made my pulse race. Every knock from another apartment, every voice on the stairs made me think, for one irrational moment, that Max might appear outside, demanding to be let in, reminding me of who I used to be to him. But he didn't come. What did come, instead, was an envelope slid carefully under my door late one afternoon, thick, official, chilling in its weight. And when I picked it up and saw my name typed cleanly on the front, something inside me sank before I had even opened it, because some instinct already knew this was not a letter of reconciliation or understanding. It was the next level of his response. I sat down slowly and opened the envelope, unfolding the stiff pages inside, and my eyes moved across the words that made my stomach twist into ice. Legal notice. Underneath it, the name of a law firm I had never heard of, and language that was both professional and horrifying, stating that my son, Maximilian, had reason to believe that I was no longer capable of making rational and consistent financial decisions, that I had acted erratically and against my own best interest by cutting him off, and that for my own protection and the protection of family assets, they were seeking legal evaluation regarding my competence. Competence. As if I were a broken machine. As if the moment I stopped serving him, I had suddenly lost my mind. I read the letter twice to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding it, but each time the meaning remained the same. My own son was preparing to legally question my sanity in order to regain control of what he had lost, and a bitter, almost surreal realization spread through me. The party, the exclusion, the words, the manipulation, it had all been just the beginning, the warning sign that I had ignored for too long, and now the real battle had begun. For a moment, fear tried to overtake me, an old fear rooted in the idea that children always have more power than mothers, once time has worn them down. But that fear was quickly replaced by something hotter, sharper, and almost unfamiliar. Anger. Not the blind, helpless anger of a wounded parent, but the focused anger of a woman who had been betrayed one time too many. I looked around my small apartment, at the photos on the shelves, at the sofa he had never sat on, at the cups he had never lifted here, and I realized that if he believed he could erase me, control me, humiliate me for money, then he had underestimated the very person who had raised him. And in that moment of chilling clarity, I made another decision that would change everything. I would not cry and hide. I would defend myself. The next phone call I made was not to him and not to anyone connected to him, but to a lawyer whose number I found through a recommendation from a senior legal service. A calm, measured man named Mr. Andrews, whose voice did not soften with pity nor harden with judgment when I explained the situation. "What your son is attempting," he said slowly, "is called financial domination. By coercion. It happens more often than you'd like to think. But don't worry, Mrs. Smith. The law is on your side as long as we act quickly and carefully." Those words, "the law is on your side," spread through me like warmth after a long winter, because for once, someone was not asking what I could give. They were offering to protect what remained. Over the next hour, I explained everything to him. The years of support, the canceled transfer, the party, the words, the sudden legal threat. And he listened without interrupting, then finally said, "I'm going to need documentation. Any proof of the financial assistance you gave him, any messages that show dependency or pressure, and then we are going to prepare for his next move before he makes it." When I hung up, I realized that in a matter of days, I had gone from silent supporter to someone preparing for a legal defense against her own child, and it was surreal, heartbreaking, and empowering all at once. And as I gathered my old bank statements from drawers and boxes, dragging years of silent generosity out into the light of reality, I noticed something strange happening inside me. I was no longer thinking of Max as my son, not in the old sense where that word meant unconditional softness. I was beginning to see him as a man who had made choices, deliberate and selfish ones, and that shift in perspective, as brutal as it was, steadied my hands as I placed each paper in order, because it was easier to defend myself against a man than against the ghost of a little boy I used to rock to sleep. By evening, my table was covered in evidence, records, numbers, notes, everything he had never believed existed, because in his mind, I'd always been someone who gave without accounting, who obeyed without record, who loved without memory. But now he was about to discover that even silent women remember everything. As I sat there looking at the piles of paper, I knew one thing with certainty. Max had made a dangerous mistake when he assumed that I would collapse once the money stopped. He had confused kindness with weakness, and devotion with stupidity. And very soon he would have to face a truth he had spent years avoiding, that my greatest strength had never been my money. It had been my endurance. And now that same endurance was no longer serving him. It was serving me, and the storm he had just summoned was not going to pass quietly. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was living the life of another woman, watching myself move through unfamiliar territory with a strength I didn't know I still possessed, because the same hands that had once trembled as they signed checks for Max were now calmly organizing files, evidence, timelines, statements, and every single document that proved my mind was not broken, only finally awake. And when Mr. Andrews arrived at my apartment 2 days later, stepping carefully around the stacks of papers that filled my table, chairs, and sofa, he let out a slow whistle under his breath and said, "Mrs. Smith, if competence is measured by awareness and organization, then your son has already lost." And that simple sentence gave me more validation than years of forced gratitude from Max ever had, because for so long I had been made to feel that my value was measured by my usefulness to him, and not by my intelligence, experience, or right to exist as an independent human being. And Mr. Andrews carefully went through every document, every bank statement, every screenshot of messages in which Max asked for money, begged for help, pressured me emotionally, guilted me, manipulated me, treating me less like a mother and more like an inexhaustible account. And the more he read, the tighter his jaw became, until he finally looked up at me and said quietly, "I want you to understand something very clearly. You are not a confused old woman. You are a victim of sustained financial exploitation, and we are going to prove that in court." And though his words were meant to reassure me, they also cut deep because hearing the truth spoken aloud confirmed just how far things had gone and how blind I had willingly been for the sake of someone who did not hesitate to turn on me the moment I closed my hands. The court date arrived faster than I expected, and as I stood in front of the mirror that morning, carefully fastening the buttons of a simple navy dress, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because I looked younger or more beautiful, but because there was a new stillness in my eyes, a calm resolve that had replaced fear, as if the part of me that had once looked for permission to exist had finally stepped aside and allowed a stronger version to take her place. And when I arrived at the courthouse, I saw Max in the hallway, standing with his fiancée and an expensive-looking lawyer, her face pale but determined, his posture rigid, jaw set as if he were already preparing for battle. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel the instinctive pull to go to him, to ask if he was okay, to comfort him as if he were still the boy who needed me to kiss away his hurts. Instead, I walked past him as if he were a stranger, and in some tragic, painful way, that was exactly who he had become. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was cold and heavy, every sound magnified, every step echoing with the weight of decisions that could alter a life. And when the judge entered, an older man with eyes that looked as though he had long grown tired of lies disguised as concern, I felt a strange sense of peace, because for once, I wasn't here to beg for approval or understanding. I was here to speak the truth, and Max S. Lawyer began with a carefully crafted story, painting me as a lonely, aging woman confused by technology, manipulated by neighbors and strangers, suffering from emotional instability triggered by abandonment issues and imagined neglect, claiming my decision to cancel the financial support was evidence of paranoia and irrational thinking. And when I heard him speak those words, I almost smiled, because not one of them came from actual concern, only from desperation over lost money. Then Lena was called to the stand, and her performance was chilling in its precision, her voice trembling, her eyes glassy with carefully summoned tears. "She changed completely, Your Honor," she said, gesturing vaguely toward me without even looking directly at me. "She became cold, aggressive, secretive. We feared she was a danger to herself, and as she spoke, I realized how practiced she was at rewriting reality to suit her version of events, and I felt no anger toward her anymore, only a strange pity for someone who could twist lies into such believable shapes." Then it was Max's turn to speak, and seeing him sitting there under oath, stating that I was no longer capable of managing my own life, that I was unstable and emotionally dangerous to myself, that he was only trying to protect me, was one of the deepest betrayals I had ever experienced, because this was not just about money anymore. This was about power, about control, about his unwillingness to accept that he no longer owned me. And yet when he spoke, I noticed something he clearly did not. His hands were shaking, he could barely meet the judge's eyes, and the confidence he was trying to project was cracking through the edges of his desperation. Then Mr. Andrews stood, and the courtroom seemed to lean forward slightly, and in a calm, measured tone, he began to dismantle their entire narrative piece by piece, presenting my bank records, showing the consistent pattern of payments in Max's favor, the absence of any irregular spending on my part, the fact that after cutting him off, my finances were more stable and organized than they had been in years. He presented written testimony from my neighbor, from the banker who handled my accounts, from my doctor who confirmed I had no mental or cognitive impairments. And finally, he spoke the words that hung in the air like a verdict, even before the judge made one. "Your Honor, the only irregularity in this woman's behavior is that for the first time in years, she stopped allowing herself to be exploited." When I was called to testify, I walked to the stand slowly but without hesitation, and for a brief second I caught Max's eyes, and I saw something in them then. Not anger or superiority, but fear, because he finally understood that I was not the submissive figure he had grown used to, and the truth was no longer something he could silence with guilt or demands. I spoke clearly, every word pulled straight from years of suppressed truth. I told the court exactly how much I had supported him, how rarely he had visited unless money was involved, how he had forgotten me when the time came to celebrate, how his words at the party had been the final fracture of a lifetime of emotional neglect. And I said something that made even Lena gasp. I am not here because my son wants to protect me. I am here because my son is angry that he can no longer control me, and the judge watched me carefully, as if measuring the strength of not just my mind, but my spirit. And when the testimonies were complete and silence filled the courtroom, the judge adjusted his glasses and spoke in a steady, unwavering tone. This court finds no evidence of mental incompetence in Mrs. Smith. On the contrary, the evidence suggests a sustained effort by the plaintiff to financially depend upon and emotionally manipulate the defendant. The petition is denied in full. The words washed over me like rain after a lifetime of drought, and though the room spun slightly around me, not from weakness but from the sheer emotional release, I heard a muffled sound behind me and realized it was Lena beginning to cry again. Real tears this time, not for me but for what had slipped forever out of her reach. And Maxette's face turned pale, his illusion of control crumbling in front of a room full of strangers who now saw him for exactly what he was. Not a caring son, but a man trying to steal what he did not earn. As I walked out of that courtroom, the world felt different, as if gravity itself had shifted in my favor, and outside, in the quiet brightness of the day, I inhaled deeply for the first time in years, without feeling like I owed the air to anyone. In the weeks that followed, I changed everything. I moved to a smaller, brighter apartment, one filled with sunlight instead of memories. I changed my phone number. I redirected my savings into a new account protected by legal boundaries no one could cross. I began taking painting classes, something I'd abandoned decades ago because Max might need that money. I made friends who cared more about my stories than my wallet, who laughed with me about the weather, the flowers, the small, beautiful details of life I had ignored for too long. I traveled. I lived. And not once did I hear from him again. Not an apology, not a goodbye, just silence. But in that silence, there was no more pain, only peace, because sometimes closure is not someone coming back to say sorry. Sometimes closure is the realization that they never deserved the version of you that loved them so completely. And as I sit now on my balcony, the evening sky painted in shades of gold and purple, I think back to the moment he said, "It was better this way," and I finally understand something he never will. He was right. It was better this way. Better for me. Better for the woman I finally allowed myself to become. Because I am no longer just his forgotten mother. I am the author of the rest of my own life. And if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have continued to give until there was nothing left? Or would you have chosen yourself when the world told you not to? I would love to know your thoughts. Share them with me in the comments. And if my story touched you, support me by subscribing for more real-life stories like this. Some are heartbreaking, some are inspiring, but all of them carry one truth. It is never too late to wake up and choose yourself.